a handful of books that restarted Western civilization. We stand today upon a foundation that was nearly lost to the dust of 1,000 years. To understand where we are going, we must perform a technical audit of where we fell. For nearly a millennium, Europe did not live, it lingered. It lived on the scraps of a feast it had forgotten, a civilization in stasis. There is a modern trend among revisionist historians to claim the Dark Ages weren't actually dark. They point to the Carolingian Renaissance or the flourishing of northern Italy. But as you noted, these were isolated flickers, the forerunners of the revival, not the standard for the 500 years following 476 AD. The revisionists often confuse the end of the Middle Ages, the 12th century Renaissance, with the long silent centuries that preceded it. To defend the Dark Ages is to ignore the literal filth and intellectual stagnation that occurred when the classics were locked away. Consider the sheer data of decay. In the 2nd century, the city of Rome was a marvel of the world, a metropolis of 1 million people supported by 11 grand aqueducts, moving 300 million gallons of water every single day. By the 10th century, that same Rome, the eternal city, was a collection of mud huts and ruins, totaling barely 30,000 souls. This was not merely a loss of population. It was a total collapse of technical literacy. We lost the recipe for concrete. We lost the geometry of the dome. In the darkness, we replaced the empirical observation of the ancients with the gloss. Centuries of monks writing notes about notes, staring at parchment instead of the stars, debating the number of angels on a needle instead of dissecting a cadaver to save a life. Observation stopped. Science was replaced by superstition. Building stopped. The secret to Roman concrete was lost. Grand stone masonry was replaced by timber and mud thatch. Reading stopped. Literacy became the exclusive property of a tiny clerical elite, used primarily for liturgy rather than the expansion of human knowledge. But the giant is awake. The Dark Ages ended not by miracle, but by transmission. It was a relay race where the baton was dropped in the mud, only to be recovered by a handful of book hunters and a revolutionary machine, the printing press. The restart of Western civilization began in the damp cellars of forgotten monasteries. Imagine the apostle of the Renaissance, Poggio Bracciolini, traveling to remote Swiss abbeys, bribing guards to enter neglected libraries. In 1417, he pulled a single dusty manuscript from the shadows, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. This Roman text, which dared to argue that the world was made of invisible atoms, provided the very DNA for modern physics. Then came the bridge, Marcus Tullius Cicero. For centuries, Cicero was a marble statue, a dry authority on Latin grammar. But in 1345, the scholar Petrarch found Cicero's personal letters in Verona. He didn't find a god. He found a man, anxious, political, and deeply committed to the res publica, the public thing. Petrarch's dialogue with the dead sparked a Cicero-mania that shifted the Western mind from monastic isolation to civic duty. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, Greek scholars fled to Italy with crates of manuscripts, Plato, Aristotle, and the mathematicians, that the West hadn't seen in a millennium. But these manuscripts were fragile. They were prone to the errors of tired scribes. The true reboot required the printing press. In Venice, the Silicon Valley of the 1490s, printers like Aldus Manutius didn't just print books, they standardized human knowledge. They cleaned up 1,000 years of copying errors. For the first time, a student in Edinburgh and a surgeon in Rome we're looking at the exact same diagram, the exact same law, the exact same truth. Science and mathematics, the grammar of reality. The Dark Ages were dark because we lost the math. We found it again in the 1482 printing of Euclid's Elements. This was the most important textbook ever published. It moved the West from counting to calculating. Euclid provided the axiomatic method, the logic that you start with a simple truth and prove everything else. This is the logic of the scientific revolution. It is the logic of computer programming today. Before the re-emergence of elements, much of European math was recipe-based. If you wanted to build a wall, you used a rule of thumb. Euclid changed the game by introducing deductive reasoning, the old way. This works because it worked yesterday. The Euclidean way. This works because it is a logical necessity derived from first principles. Euclid starts with 5 simple postulates, axioms, statements so obvious they require no proof, e.g., a straight line segment can be drawn joining any 2 points. From these tiny seeds, he grew a massive tree of 465 propositions. This is exactly why you linked it to computer programming. Axioms, your initial variables and constants. Propositions, your functions and logic gates. The result: a program that cannot fail if the initial logic is sound. Without Euclid, there is no Newton or Spinoza. Isaac Newton literally modeled the structure of his Principia Mathematica after Euclid's Elements. He knew that if he wanted to prove gravity, he couldn't just show observations. He had to build an axiomatic framework that made his conclusions undeniable. While manuscripts existed before, the 1482 Venice edition by Erhard Ratdolt was a technological marvel. It was one of the first books to successfully print complex geometric diagrams alongside text. It democratized rigor. It took the logic of the elite and turned it into a standardized textbook that could be mass-produced, ensuring that every scientist in Europe was finally speaking the same mathematical language. Alongside Euclid stood the giants of the Greek tradition. Pythagoras gave us the harmony of numbers, Democritus gave us the atom, and Archimedes gave us the engineering of the lever and the screw. Without Euclid's geometry, we could not calculate the trajectory of a planet or the stress points of a stone cathedral. In medicine, we transitioned from treating the soul to repairing the machine. For 1,000 years, we treated the body as a map of sins, relying on balancing humors. The recovery of Hippocrates' aphorisms and Galen's Methodus Medendi reintroduced the clinical method, the radical idea that a doctor should actually observe the patient. But the real breakthrough came in 1543, when Andreas Vesalius used the printing press to distribute his De Humani Corporis Fabrica. Because of the press, his 600 detailed anatomical woodcuts were identical in every copy. We stopped guessing what was inside the chest and started mapping it. We moved from superstition to anatomy. Before 1543, medical knowledge was essentially frozen in time. For over 1,300 years, the Roman physician Galen was the undisputed authority. The problem? Galen's observations were largely based on the dissection of monkeys, dogs, and pigs, because Roman law forbade human dissection. Vesalius broke the mold by getting his own hands bloody. He realized that to correct Galen, he needed to document the human body with unprecedented precision. He didn't just write. He directed a small army of artists, likely from the studio of Titian, including John van Calcar. Philosophy, law, and the birth of the citizen civilization cannot exist without a predictable, transparent legal framework. The Dark Ages relied on trial by combat, walking on hot coals to prove innocence. We replaced this chaos by printing the Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's Code. This Roman legal body provided the blueprint for property law and contracts. It allowed a merchant in Venice to trade with a merchant in London because they finally shared a common language of logic and evidence. But how should a man live in this new world? For this we return to Cicero's De Officiis, on duties, and De Re Publica. Cicero was the bridge between the Greek inheritance and the Enlightenment. He taught that an individual has a humanitas, a duty to the state and to their own intellectual development. Cicero analyzed the structures of power. He saw three good forms of governance: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and their three dark twins: tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule. His conclusion? The only successful state is one of checks and balances. This specific printed text traveled directly into the hands of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. The success of Great Britain and the United States, the dominant liberal democracies of our era, is built on this Ciceronian foundation, the idea that no one man should hold all the light. To understand how Cicero's philosophy serves as the blueprint for the modern world, we have to look at his work not just as old books, but as the original user manual for a functional society. Cicero wasn't just a theorist. He was a lawyer and politician fighting to save a crumbling republic. He knew that human nature is messy and power is addictive. Cicero analyzed power through a lens of inevitable decay. He believed that every pure form of government contains the seeds of its own destruction. Cicero observed that states usually bounce between extremes. A king becomes a tyrant. The nobles overthrow him, but become an elite clique. The people rebel to find freedom, but descend into lawless chaos, which eventually leads back to a strong man, monarchy, to restore order. The genius that Jefferson and Locke inherited was Cicero's mixed model. He argued that the only way to stop the cycle of decay was to bake all three good forms into one system simultaneously. This is the origin of checks and balances. The executive, the monarchic element, provides decisive leadership. The Senate, the aristocratic element, provides wisdom, experience, and long-term vision. The assemblies, the democratic element, ensures the liberty of the people and their buy-in to the law. By forcing these three forces to compete, no single entity can hold all the light. If the executive overreaches, the Senate and the people pull him back. Cicero argued that a state's health isn't measured by how many people vote, but by how difficult it is for any one person or group to exercise absolute power. Liberty consists not in having a good master, but in having no master at all. Cicero. Modern autocrats love democracy, the ceremony of the vote, but they hate the republic, the friction of independent institutions. Independent judiciary, a judge who can say no to the president. Free press, a voice that can criticize the first citizen. Legislative oversight, a body that controls the purse strings. When these are removed, you are left with illiberal democracy, a system where the majority, or a faked majority, provides the cover for a tyranny. Democracy is not the same as liberty. Pure democracy is the rule of the many. But without the Ciceronian mixed constitution, it inevitably spoils into what Cicero called ochlocracy, mob rule. In a pure democracy, 51% of the people can vote to take the property, lives, or rights of the 49%. This is the tyranny of the majority. The rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s is the ultimate cautionary tale. They used the democratic process, the will of the people, to dismantle the republic. Because the German, Weimar, system lacked the robust, stubborn checks and balances Cicero advocated for, the majority was able to legally abolish freedom. When John Locke sat down to write about natural rights, or when Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, they weren't reinventing the wheel, they were reviving Cicero. Cicero's definition of a republic, res publica, was the property of the people. He argued that the law is the bond which unites a society. This shifted the focus from the will of a ruler to the rule of law. This Ciceronian humanitas provides the moral backbone for liberal democracy, the belief that the individual has inherent dignity and a responsibility to protect the framework that grants him freedom. How should a man live today? According to Cicero, by cultivating his mind so that he is fit to govern himself, and by participating in his society so that no one else governs him without his consent. Architecture and urbanization, the rule of proportion. Finally, look at our homes and our cities. The Dark Ages, built for defense, thick walls, tiny windows, huddling behind a moat. The Renaissance, built for man. The discovery of Vitruvius's De Architectura gave us the code for the arch, the dome, and the three orders. We stopped building by feel and started building by mathematics. Using Euclid's optics, architects like Brunelleschi and Alberti invented linear perspective. They realized the eye sees in a visual pyramid. This allowed for the return of the piazza, the urban lungs of a city, designed for public discourse and commerce. When you look at the Dome of Florence, you are seeing Euclid's theorems in stone. When you walk through a city with a grid and a public square, you are walking through a Roman dream revived by a German press and an Italian heart. Conclusion: civilization is not a miracle. It is a transmission. The Middle Ages dropped the baton because they stopped reading, stopped observing, and stopped building. We are no longer waiting for the next life. We are documenting this one. We have the tools, the press to spread the word, the classics to provide the map, and the science to build the way. By reading Cicero for our ethics, Euclid for our logic, and Vitruvius for our homes, we have done more than copy the past. We have built a future that the Romans themselves would have envied. The books are open. The press is inked. The Dark Ages are a choice. And today, let's choose the light.